Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the new album from Brockhampton, Iridescence. Now this is an album that I've been anticipating since the group dropped their last album, Saturation 3, back in December of 2017. I was a massive fan of the Saturation trilogy that came out last year, really loved all three of those projects, put them very highly on my best albums of 2017 list. In fact, they were the top 3 spots on there, and I still do stand by that ranking that I did there in that video, at least when it comes to the placement of those 3 albums. I still really love those projects. I thought they were really exciting, really interesting, really colorful, jam-packed, filled with personality, and just overall fantastic records that are very much some of my favorites in recent years. So of course I had big expectations for a new album from Brockhampton. In fact, if you go back to my most anticipated albums for this year list I did towards the beginning of this year, this new album from Brockhampton was #1, though of course at the time we all believed the new album was going to be called Team Effort. That's not what it is, but it doesn't really matter what it's called. The new Brockhampton album is a new Brockhampton album, and I was of course pretty excited for it. But of course between then and now it's been a bit of a rocky road for Brockhampton getting up to the release of this album. Between of course the whole Amir Van situation that went on involving him eventually getting kicked out of the group, as well as just the delay in the release of this album, or rather, I guess, the scrapping of whatever album they had almost done, prior to that whole situation occurring, and then, of course, the creation of this new album here. It didn't quite work out the way that Brockhampton initially planned it out to. And, of course, between that whole incident happening, of course, the changing in the group dynamic now that Amir is no longer in the group, as well as the fact that, coming into this album, of course, we had those 3 singles that were released that didn't end up on this album. They were just loose singles, I'm guessing. And I did review 1999 Wildfire on the channel. Didn't review the other 2 because I thought they were going to be on this album, so I didn't listen to them before because I didn't want to hear too many songs from the new album beforehand. But maybe I'll talk about those someday. But regardless, I think that they're decent songs, but maybe not quite up to the same level of quality, I guess, as some of the singles that we got from the Saturation trilogy. So I was maybe a little bit concerned coming into this new project that maybe Brockhampton weren't going to, deliver as good an album as they did with either 3 of the Saturation projects. I mean, don't get me wrong, I expected this album to be good, but would it be as good as the Saturation trilogy? And the answer to that question is no, it's not as good as the Saturation trilogy. It's better. In fact, this is an album that I am really, really loving. In fact, this is easily my album of the year as of right now, and I see very little reason for that to change going forward in the next few months, because this album right here really blew me away, and that's a big deal considering the previous 3 albums from these guys also really blew me away to some extent. But I think that this one manages to be even better somehow. Iridescence has a sound fairly different from the Saturation trilogy, which is something that I would expect given that that series of albums were all, part of a series. They were going to have a sound to them. Not to say that each album didn't have its own quirks to it, but Iridescence is completely different from either of those 3 albums. It's much darker, much more abrasive at times, and this is mostly the result of Brockhampton on this album reflecting on their own personal success and kind of coming to the realization that it's not quite all it panned out to be, which is a theme that is fairly common for artists to explore once they reach a certain level of success after not being there initially. However, Brockhampton presented it in a very interesting way on this project, because they're not just talking about how, this new money that they're getting and new fame and success is leading to all these new problems in their lives, like many artists do. They're also reflecting on the fact that all these old problems that they had and that we heard them talking about on, like, the first Saturation album before they blew up, or on older projects like the All American Trash mixtape, or like solo albums from them, loose singles, all that type of stuff. The problems that they presented on those pieces of music are still very much relevant to them now. Problems like depression and suicidal thoughts and drug use as a result of this. These are all still problems that the members of the group deal with, even though now that they have the money to, afford a house and a car and help their families out financially. They have the success, to pretty much do this as for a living, rather than be worried that this project that they're working on isn't going to get anywhere, and that their decisions to, maybe not continue with college or something along those lines won't end up, paying off for them. Despite the fact that things are looking good for them, it's led to, these problems that they haven't really been fixed. And on top of that, they have a whole new slew of problems as a result of the success being added on top of it. Things like paranoia, having trust issues, and of course these are probably made worse by things like the whole Amir Van situation that happened earlier this year. The guys in Brockhampton, despite being in a better place, success-wise and financially speaking, they're not necessarily in a better place, mentally and, as people. And it's very interesting to see this play out, considering, like I said, from the first Saturation album on that project, when they recorded that album, they weren't big. Nobody really knew who they were all that much. I mean, they did have fans, but they had yet to really blow up, and they weren't really sure if they were going to be successful. You could feel the hunger on that project. Going back to it, talks about, how they need to be successful pretty much, because if they're not successful, they're not going to be able to, what are they going to do with their lives? They're not going to be able to keep themselves working the way that they are if they're not going to be successful. And eventually that ended up happening. They did get successful, but now the whole fame that they've gotten hasn't quite turned out to be what they expected. And it's very interesting to see how they developed from that first Saturation album up to this one, which is, saying quite a bit considering that album was released only a little bit over a year ago and there's such a big change in that short amount of time. It's very interesting, and I really like how Brockhampton handled the themes on this album overall. And it's made even better by the fact that this album just feels so consistent and focused. The Saturation trilogy, while it had a very nice flow to it, it was definitely a series of albums where you could take individual tracks and just listen to them on their own and they'd be pretty enjoyable. Having them in the context of the record as a whole, yeah, it worked good. The tracks flowed together very nicely, and they're all really great tracks. So, you'd have great track after great track after great track. But here on this album, I think Brockhampton put a lot more focus into having it sound very consistent from start to finish. Lots of songs across this thing reference the same themes. Like I said, the ones I mentioned before, talking about how they have more money and success now, how they're still struggling with the problems they had before, how they have all these new problems as well. These are all talked about on a great majority of these tracks, and while each song definitely does focus in on more specific subtopics, I guess you could sum up this album's themes as a whole as being those general things that I've just spent a good few minutes talking about. Whereas with the Saturation trilogy, there was a lot more things going on, and I feel like each member had their own kind of, lyrical themes that they would explore pretty much. It was kind of about wanting to be successful. And, they'd have their own personal things that they talked about. And that still does happen here. They do have their own personal quirks when it comes to their lyrics and things like that. But it's still focused a lot more in on these greater themes that are addressed throughout the entire project. And I feel like it was pulled off very nicely. Another thing that really helps with the focused feel of this project is the fact that I feel like a lot more of the members of the group are kind of coming together on one track and sharing the time on here equally, I guess. I mean, the time shared between each of the members was pretty equal on the Saturation trilogy, but here it feels even more just evenly split between everyone. And this is especially noticeable when it comes to certain members like Bareface, who previously on the Saturation trilogy, he did the closing tracks, and he occasionally popped in on some other songs to provide some vocals, but he easily had the least amount of time on those projects compared to some of the other, members of the group. And I can understand why, because, his singing style maybe doesn't, mesh together quite as nicely as some of the others do when it comes to making the more hip-hop focused tracks. But here on this project, they managed to fix this by having him occasionally do some rapping, which is something I did not expect from him, but works very nicely. And not only that, but there's times on here where his voice is manipulated like how many of the members of the group occasionally do. And it creates the manipulated version of his voice has a very distinct sound to it as well, which is very nice. And it definitely has a very just cool sounding effect that I really enjoyed. And of course he does do some singing here as well, like you would expect him to, and even when he does that, it's integrated so effortlessly into the songs that it appears in. Even if it's a more hip-hop focused track or something like that, it's just so flawlessly put in there. It's not just like, you have a whole album of the hip-hop tracks and then it closes out with this Bareface solo song. He's incorporated so much better into these songs. You'll have tracks like Tonya, where he starts off the track really providing this verse that's sung before it moves into the more typical hip-hop type track. You also have tracks like Thug Life, where he's providing some nice vocals split in there very just so smoothly that it works out very it just sounds amazing pretty much. I'm at a loss for words with how nicely they were able to incorporate him onto this project, and not just in ways that involved him singing. I like how they got him rapping on here. I thought it was very well done. This album is much darker and grittier and more aggressive than either three of the Saturation albums that came before, as I said before. And I don't want to give the wrong idea that this album is a super aggressive project from start to finish. I've seen many people comparing this to more aggressive industrial acts like Death Grips, which I really don't get personally, because yeah, this is more experimental hip-hop than what they were doing on the Saturation trilogy, but like, this is still a good ways off from anything like Death Grips, honestly. I really don't get the connection all that much, especially considering that there are many tracks on here that aren't very heavy, aren't very aggressive and in your face, like the last three tracks that go back to back to back that are more introspective, or tracks like Thug Life, for example. Honey is another one. There's a good few tracks on here that aren't super aggressive or anything, and don't get me wrong, these tracks, it doesn't mean the tracks are bad, and it doesn't mean that they're certainly not weird. They have their own quirks to them that I find very interesting and very exciting, but they're not doing so in a way that's very aggressive or anything quite like that. And as for the aggressive tracks on here, I think they're very well done as well. Most notably, there's the track, I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, but Jovert, I'm definitely pronouncing that wrong because I'm bad with names, but this track is really something special. I find the hook on the track to be pretty catchy that Joba provides, and then his verse on this track is easily the most aggressive he's provided yet, and also one of the most personal that he's provided yet. He just seems very out of sorts here, but like he's supposed to feel that way on here, and it really grabs your attention, and you really listen to what he says here, and it's quite impressive. And then of course Bareface has a great rap part later on as well, and Merlin has a pretty good rap verse on here later on. I love the kind of beat switch up that occurs as he begins his verse. It just adds to the very all over the place and wild feel that this track has going for it, and I really loved it for that reason. The opening track on this thing, New Orleans, is one that is probably the most typical for Brockhampton, I guess you could say, at least compared to the material that they put out in the past. It's just more of this straightforward, banging hip-hop track with everyone providing a verse. Jaden Smith also comes in and has a little guest feature on there as well, which I thought was pretty good as well. He fits nicely here on the track. I feel like he even could have provided a longer verse and it would have sounded pretty, fine, honestly. But still, I really love what they were doing on this track here. Like I said, it's probably the most typical track on this entire project for Brockhampton, which I think is a good thing to put at the start of the project as a nice transition from what fans might be expecting based on the Saturation trilogy into what you're going to be getting later on with some of this different sounding stuff. And when it comes to tracks that have a lot of lyrical depth to them, there's a good amount on here. For example, Wait, where they're talking about the things that kind of weigh them down, I guess you could say, mentally speaking, their own personal problems, if you will, personal demons, things like that. Much of the things I was talking about earlier on in the video. Then you have the three tracks at the end of this project, which are three of my favorites on the entire album, probably three of my favorite songs Brockhampton have ever released. First, you have San Marcos, which is a very interesting track, especially considering that, it has to do kind of with reflecting on where they came from originally and all this, especially considering that now, like I said, this album is all about them kind of reflecting on their success and how it hasn't really ended up being what they maybe expected. It's a pretty interesting track lyrically, and I do love the singing spread across this track as well, just the more organic feel it has to it. And even though that they've reached this point, this pretty popular point that they're at now, they still, as they say on the track, want more out of life than what they're getting now. They don't just want the money and the fame and the success and the ability to help out the people in their lives. They want to feel, okay themselves. They don't want to have to deal with these personal problems, like I said before, things like depression and addiction. They don't want to have to deal with these problems. They want to just be happy pretty much, and they're still not quite there yet. Then you have the track Tonya, which was originally released live a couple months before the release of this album. I did talk about it briefly in my track review for 1999 Wildfire, if you're curious on checking that out, but of course it was only based off the live version. But the studio version of this track is fantastic. It takes all the things I liked about the live version and makes it even better pretty much. I love the song opening, as I said before, with Bareface doing his thing. He really shows off his pipes here, and it's a great start to this track pretty much. And then later on in the track, once the actual rapping begins, you get some pretty interesting and introspective verses, especially like Kevin's, where he's talking about how he'd rather trade his fame away for like a very just normal life in Texas where he grew up, which is pretty interesting because considering where he is kind of come from with his lyrics in the past. It always seemed like he just wanted to get out of where he was before and become a superstar and things like that. But then again, as I said before, fame isn't quite what you expected, and now he's kind of reflecting that maybe he would want to still be making music, but do it at the same time while being just a normal person, pretty much. Because if he was just a normal person, he wouldn't have to deal with a bunch of these new problems that he's dealing with now. It's pretty interesting to hear, and I really liked it. And this is easily one of my favorites on the entire album, if not one of my favorite tracks, or my favorite one on here. And you have the closing track, Fabric, which is also a fantastic song. I love the hook on this track as well. It just sounds very soulful almost, and is also rather catchy. And the verses on here also dealing with a lot more personal, themes as well that I really liked. I especially liked how they did these 3 tracks back to back to back, because they all kind of expand on each other, I feel. And given that there's some of the less abrasive, more introspective tracks, I just felt like it was a nice way to close out the album and left me with a lot to think about overall. The production throughout this album varies from, like I said before, very aggressive, more experimental sounding production on songs like District or Jovert. Once again, I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, but then you have the more soothing tracks, I guess you could say, the less aggressive ones, like the 3 tracks that come towards the back end of this thing, or Something About Him, for example. And while these tracks, as I said before, are definitely less experimental and abrasive, they still have some very interesting quirks to them that make them stand out. They're not just typical beats or anything quite like that. They really did do an excellent job with the production on this thing. It all just comes together so nicely, and it just plays together very nicely with the vocals and the lyrics on this thing to create a very interesting, abrasive atmosphere. So overall, I'm really loving this album. Since it first came out, I've been replaying it pretty much non-stop, and that's not just because I need to review it or anything. It's just because I genuinely love this album enough to actually do that without getting bored of it. Every time I come back to this thing, there's something new that stands out to me. Another point where I'm like, the lyrics here connect back to something somewhere else, or where I just notice a little detail in the production that really stands out to me or something. It's a project that I'm just really loving overall. There's not really much else to say about it in that regard. And I feel like I'm going to be coming back to this project a whole lot the rest of this year. And in general, this is a fantastic project, at least in my own opinion. And I'm sure that not everyone is going to love it as much as I am, because it's different sounding from Brockhampton's previous 3 albums. And while, they do have 3 albums that came before this, all 3 of those albums were kind of like their first album in a sense, given that they were all released as part of the Saturation series and have a similar sound overall, I'd say. Like I said, each of those albums does have their own little distinctions between them that you could tell them apart with, but it's nowhere near as distinct as this album is compared to either of those 3. In that regard, people who have maybe, love the sound of the Saturation trilogy and expect that from Brockhampton nonstop aren't going to be a fan of this one here necessarily, because it does, like I said, sound a bit different overall. But, I just felt like this album really took what Brockhampton did with the Saturation trilogy, took a lot of the good things about that series, changed some things up, of course, so it would be different, but while also refining a lot of the chemistry in the group, making it a lot even more dynamic than it was before. Like I said, the even sharing of the the members in this group when it comes to the vocal duties was something I was really impressed by. I love how focused the lyrics are across this project while still being able to explore each of these members individually. Like I said, you still get each of the members' individual lyrical quirks running throughout here, but they tie it back together to a lot of these greater messages and themes that are just littered across this project. I love how the production on this thing manages to go from being very abrasive at times to being a lot less abrasive, more calm, but still manages to be very interesting and weird while also still sounding cohesive. Like I said, it takes what the Saturation trilogy did for this group and refines a lot of the little problems that I maybe had with some of those albums. They weren't really problems that got in the way of me enjoying those projects because I did love those albums, but here they're pretty much completely gone. Like, did Brockhampton release an almost perfect album here? I mean, at least to me, personally speaking, I think they might have, actually. And I don't, it's not often that I would give an album like a 10 out of 10 or a perfect score or something like that. I'm not just someone who throws that at every album I hear that I get, the slightest bit of enjoyment from. The last album I think I gave a 10 out of 10 to, in terms of, when it was released in relation to now, was back in 2014 with Run the Jewels 2. So it's been a bit of time, but I think I gotta give this one the 10 out of 10, the perfect score. Because how could I not? I've replayed this thing a bunch since it came out. Every time, finding new things to enjoy, new aspects to really dive into and explore and fall in love with, new things just every single time I listen to it. I love the cohesion here while also sounding varied. I love how they really honed in on their technical skill here. It's just such an enjoyable project. It has so much replay value. I don't feel like there's a single weak track on here, really. And while, there's some tracks that I maybe prefer more than others, it's not by all that much. And even the weakest that this album has to offer is very strong overall. So yeah, I'm really loving this project. In fact, I might even go as far as to say Brockhampton maybe released the perfect album here, at least when it comes to my own personal enjoyment. Like I said, if you happen to have your own personal opinion that's different than mine, that's a-okay, perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave it in the comment section down below. I greatly appreciate seeing your thoughts on this project, considering I'm really enjoying it and I love discussing music with people. But yeah, that is just my own personal opinion, and who knows, maybe in a few months' time, I don't like this album as much as I do now. Maybe it starts to fade on me a little bit, and I think it's only like a 9 or an 8 out of 10 or something like that, if we're talking number scores or something like that. But as of right now, guys, I don't think so. Like I said, I really love the Saturation trilogy. I replay those albums a lot, especially when they first came out. But I've listened to this album more as soon as it came out, compared to Saturation 2 and 3 and 1 when those came out. So I just feel like this has to be better. And considering how great those albums were, I feel like this is it. This is, a 10 out of 10 pretty much in my opinion. And yeah, that's all there really is to say about it. So yeah, if you enjoyed this review, greatly appreciate it if you leave a like, subscribe to the channel, comment down below like I said before. Thanks for watching, guys, and stay golden.